Part 4 of The Ethical Engineer by Harry Harrison. Chapter 9. Edipon's good mood remained, and Jason took advantage of it by extracting as many concessions as possible. By hinting that there might be more traps in the engine, permission was easily gained to do all the work on the original site instead of inside the sealed and guarded buildings. A covered shed gave them protection from the weather, and a test stand was constructed to hold the engines when Jason worked on them. This was of a unique design and built to Jason's exacting specification, and since no one, including Micah, had ever heard or seen of a test stand before, Jason had his way. The first engine proved to have a burnt-out bearing, and Jason rebuilt it by melting down the original bearing metal and casting it in position. When he unbolted the head of the massive single cylinder, he shuddered at the clearance around the piston. He could fit his fingers into the opening between the piston and the cylinder wall. By introducing cylinder rings, he doubled the compression and power output. When Edipon saw the turn of speed the rebuilt engine gave his caroi, he hugged Jason to his bosom and promised him the highest reward. This turned out to be a small piece of meat every day to relieve the monotony of the Krenoi meals, and a doubled guard to make sure that his valuable property did not escape. Jason had his own plans and kept busy manufacturing a number of pieces of equipment that had nothing at all to do with his engine overhauling business. While these were being assembled, he went about lining up a little aid. "What would you do if I gave you a club?" he asked a burly slave whom he was helping to haul a log toward his workshop. Narcisse and one of his brothers lazed along out of earshot, bored by the routine of guard duty. "What I do with club?" the slave grunted, forehead furrowing and mouth gaping open with the effort of thought. "That's what I asked, and keep pulling while you think. I don't want the guards to notice anything." "If I have club, I kill," the slave announced excitedly, fingers grasping eagerly for coveted weapon. "Would you kill me?" "I have club, I kill you. You not so big." "But if I gave you the club, wouldn't I be your friend? Then wouldn't you want to kill someone else?" The novelty of this alien thought stopped the slave dead, and he scratched his head perplexedly until Narcisse lashed him back to work. Jason sighed and found another slave to try his sales program on. It took a while, but the idea was eventually percolating through the ranks of the slaves. All they had to look forward to from the Zertanoi was back-breaking labor and an early death. Jason offered them something else: weapons, a chance to kill their masters, and even more killing later when they marched on Uppsala. It was difficult for them to grasp the idea that they must work together to accomplish this, and not kill Jason and each other as soon as they received weapons. It was a chancy plan at best, and would probably break down long before any visit could be made to the city. But the revolt should be enough to win them from bondage, even if the slaves fled afterwards. There were less than 50 Zertanoi at this well station, all men, with their women and children at some other settlement further back in the hills. It would not be too hard to kill them or chase them off, and long before they could bring reinforcements, Jason and his runaway slaves would be gone. There was just one factor missing from his plans, and a new draft of slaves solved even that problem for him. Happy days, he laughed, pushing open the door to his quarters and rubbing his hands together with glee. The guard shoved Micah in after him and locked the door. Jason secured it with his own interior bolt, then waved the two others over to the corner farthest from the door and the tiny window opening. "New slaves today," he told them, "and one of them is from Uppsala, a mercenary or a soldier of some kind that they captured on a skirmish. He knows that they will never let him live long enough to leave here, so he was grateful for any suggestions I had." "This is man's talk. I do not understand," Ijal said, turning away and starting toward the cooking fire. "You'll understand this," Jason said, taking her by the shoulder. "The soldier knows where Uppsala is and can lead us there. The time has come to think about leaving this place." He had all of her attention now, and Micah's as well. "How is this?" she gasped. "I have been making my plans. I have enough files and lockpicks now to crack into every room in this place. A few weapons, the key to the armory, and every able-bodied slave is on my side." What do you plan to do? Micah asked. Stage a servile revolt in the best style. The slaves fight the Zertanoi, and we get away. Perhaps with an army helping us, but at least we get away. You are talking revolution, Micah bellowed, and Jason jumped him and knocked him to the floor. Ijal held his legs down while Jason squatted on his chest and covered his mouth. What's the matter with you? Want to spend the rest of your life rebuilding stolen engines? They are guarding us too well for there to be much chance of our breaking out on our own, so we need allies. We have them, ready-made, all the slaves. Revolution, Micah mumbled through the restraining fingers. Of course it's a revolution. It is also the only possible chance of survival that these poor devils will ever have. Now they are human cattle, beaten and killed on whim. You can't be feeling sorry for the Zertanoi. Every one of them is a murderer 10 times over. You've seen them beat people to death. Do you feel that they are too nice to suffer a revolution? Micah relaxed, and Jason removed his hand slightly, ready to clamp down if the other's voice rose above a whisper. Of course they are not nice. Beasts in human garb is more truthful. I feel no mercy for them, and they should be wiped out and blotted from the face of the earth, as was Sodom and Gomorrah. But it cannot be done by revolution. Revolution is evil, inherently evil. Jason stifled a groan. Try telling that to 2/3 of the governments that now exist, since that's about how many were founded by revolution. Nice, liberal, democratic governments that were started by a bunch of lads with guns and the immense desire to run things in a manner more beneficial to themselves. How else do you get rid of the powers on your neck if there is no way to legally vote them away? If you can't vote them, shoot them. Bloody revolution! It cannot be! All right, no revolution, Jason said, getting up and wiping his hands disgustedly. We'll change the name. How about calling it a prison break? No, you wouldn't like that either. I have it. Liberation. We are going to strike the chains off these poor people and restore them to the lands from which they were stolen. The tiny fact that the slaveholders regard them as property and won't think much of the idea, therefore might get hurt in the process, shouldn't bother you. So, will you join me in this liberation movement? It is still revolution. It is whatever I decide to call it, Jason raged. You come along with me on the plans, or you will be left behind when we go. You have my word on that. He stomped over and helped himself to some soup and waited for his anger to simmer down. I cannot do it. I cannot do it, Micah brooded, staring into his rapidly cooling soup as into an oracular crystal ball, seeking guidance there. Jason turned his back in disgust. Don't end up like him, he warned Ijal, pointing his spoon back over his shoulder. Not that there's much chance that you ever will, coming as you do from a society with its feet firmly planted on the ground, or on the grave, to be more accurate. Your people see only concrete facts, and only the most obvious ones, and as simple an abstraction as trust seems beyond you, while this long-faced clown can only think in abstractions of abstractions, and the more unreal they are, the better. I bet he even worries about how many angels can dance on the head of a pin. I do not worry about it, Micah broke in, overhearing the remark. But I do think about it once in a while. It is a problem that cannot be lightly dismissed. You see? Ijal nodded. If he is wrong, and I am wrong, then you must be the only one who is right. She nodded in satisfaction at the thought. Very nice of you to say so, Jason smiled. And true, too. I lay no claim to infallibility, but I am sure that I can see the difference between abstractions and facts a lot better than either of you, and I am certainly more adroit at handling them. The Jason dinAlt fan club meeting's now adjourned. He reached his hand over his shoulder and patted himself on the back. Monster of arrogance, Micah bellowed. Oh, shut up. Pride goeth before a fall. You are a maledicent, idolatrous antipedist. Very good. And I grieve that I could have considered aiding you for even a second, or of standing by while you sin, and fear for the weakness of my own soul that I have not been able to resist temptation as I should. It grieves me, but I must do my duty. He banged loudly on the door. "Guard! Guard!" Jason dropped his bowl and started to scramble to his feet, but slipped in the spilled soup and fell. As he stood again, the locks rattled on the door and it opened. If he could reach Myka before the idiot opened his mouth, he would close it forever. Or at least knock him out before it was too late. It was too late. Narsisi poked his head in and blinked sleepily. Myka struck his most dramatic pose and pointed to Jason. "Seize and arrest that man. I denounce him for attempted revolution and planning red murder." Jason skidded to a halt and backtracked, diving into a bag of his personal belongings that lay against the wall. He scrabbled in it, then kicked the contents about, and finally came up with a metal-forming hammer that had a weighty, solid lead head. "More traitor, you!" Jason shouted at Myka as he ran at Narsisi, who had been dumbly watching the performance and mulling over Myka's words. Slow as he appeared, there was nothing wrong with his reflexes, and his shield snapped up and took Jason's blow, while his club spun over neatly and rapped Jason on the back of the hand. The numbed fingers opened and the hammer dropped to the floor. "I think you two better come with me. My father will know what to do," he said, pushing Jason and Myka ahead of him out the door. He locked it and called for one of his brothers to stand guard, then poked his captives down the hall. They shuffled along in their leg irons, Myka nobly as a martyr, and Jason seething and grinding his teeth. Edipon was not at all stupid when it came to slave rebellions, and sized up the situation even faster than Narsisi could relate it. "I have been expecting this, so it comes as no surprise." His eyes held a mean little glitter when he leveled them at Jason. "I knew the time would come when you would try to overthrow me, which was why I permitted this other to assist you and to learn your skills. As I expected, he has betrayed you to gain your position, which I award him now." "Betray? I did this for no personal gain," Myka protested. "Only the purest of motives," Jason laughed coldly. "Don't believe a word this pious crook tells you, Edipon. I'm not planning any revolutions. He just said that to get my job." "You calumniate me, Jason. I never lie. You are planning revolt. You told me." "Silence, both of you, or I'll have you beaten to death. This is my judgment. The slave Myka has betrayed the slave Jason, and whether the slave Jason is planning rebellion or not is completely unimportant. His assistant would have not denounced him unless he was sure that he could do the work as well, which is the only fact that has any importance to me. Your ideas about a worker class have troubled me, Jason. I will be glad to kill them and you at the same time. Chain him with the slaves. Myka, I award you Jason's quarter and woman, and as long as you do the work well, I will not kill you. Do it a long time, and you will live a long time." "Only the purest of motives. Is that what you said, Myka?" Jason shouted back as he was kicked from the room. The descent from the pinnacle of power was fast and smooth. Within half an hour new shackles were on Jason's wrists, and he was chained to the wall in a dark room filled with other slaves. His leg irons had been left on as an additional reminder of his new status. He rattled the chains and examined them in the dim light of a distant lamp as soon as the door was closed. "How comes the revolution?" The slave chained next to him leaned over and asked in a hoarse whisper. "Very funny. Ha ha," Jason grumbled, then moved closer for a better look at the man, who had a fine case of strabismus, his eyes pointing in independent directions. "You look familiar. Are you the new slave I talked to today?" "That's me. Snarby. Fine soldier. Pikeman. Checked out on club and dagger. 7 kills and 2 possibles on my record. You can check it yourself at the guild hall." "I remember it all, Snarby, including the fact that you know your way back to Uppsala." "I've been around." "Then the revolution is still on. In fact, it's starting right now, but I want to keep it small. Instead of freeing all these slaves, what do you say to the idea that we two escape by ourselves?" "Best idea I heard since torture was invented. We don't need all these stupid people, they just get in the way. Keep the operation small and fast. That's what I always say." "I always say that too," Jason agreed, digging into his boot with his fingertip. He had managed to shove his best file and a lockpick into hiding there while Myka was betraying him back in their room. The attack on Narsisi with the hammer had just been a cover-up. Jason had made the file himself, after many attempts at manufacturing and hardening steel, and the experiments had been successful. He picked out the clay that covered the cut he had made in his leg cuffs and tackled the soft iron with vigor. Within 3 minutes they were lying on the floor. "You a magician?" Snarby whispered, shuddering back. "Mechanic. On this planet they're the same thing." He looked around, but the exhausted slaves were all asleep and had heard nothing. Wrapping a piece of leather around it to muffle the sound, he began to file a link in the chain that secured the shackles on his wrists. "Snarby," he asked, "are we on the same chain?" "Yeah. The chain goes through these iron cuff things and holds the whole row of slaves together. The other end goes out through a hole in the wall." "Couldn't be better. I'm filing one of these links, and when it goes, we're both free. See if you can't slip the chain through the holes in your shackles and lay it down without letting the next slave know what is happening. We'll wear these iron cuffs for now. There's no time to play around with them, and they shouldn't bother us too much. Do the guards come through here at all during the night to check on the slaves?" "Not since I've been here. Just wake us up in the morning by pulling on the chain." "Then let's hope that's what happens again tonight, because we're going to need plenty of time. There." The file had cut through the link. "See if you can get enough of a grip on the other end of this link while I hold this end. We'll try and bend it open a bit." They strained silently until the opening gaped wide and the next link fitted through the cut. They slipped the chain and laid it silently on the ground, then drifted noiselessly to the door. "Is there a guard outside?" Jason asked. "Not that I know. I don't think they have enough men here to guard all the slaves." The door would not budge when they pushed against it, and there was just light enough to make out the large keyhole of a massive inset lock. Jason probed lightly with the pick and curled his lip in contempt. "These idiots have left the key in the lock." He pulled off the stiffest of his leather wrappings and, after flattening it out, pushed it under the badly fitting bottom edge of the door, leaving just a bit to hold on to. Then he poked lightly at the key through the keyhole and heard it thud to the ground outside. When he pulled the leather back, the key was lying in the center of it. The door unlocked silently, and a moment later they were outside, staring tensely into the darkness. "Let's go! Run! Get away from here!" Snarby said, and Jason grabbed him by the throat and pulled him back. "Isn't there one drop of constructive intelligence on this planet? How are you going to get to Uppsala without food or water? And if you find some, how can you carry enough? You want to stay alive, follow my instructions. I'm going to lock this door first so that no one stumbles into our escape by accident. Then we are going to get some transport and leave here in style. Agreed?" The answer was only a choked rattle until Jason opened his fingers a bit and let some air into the man's lungs. A labored groan must have meant assent, because Snarby tottered after him when he made his way through the dark alleys between the buildings. Getting clear of the walled refinery town presented no problem, since the few sentries were only looking for trouble from the outside. It was equally easy to approach Jason's leather-walled worksite from the rear and slip through it at the spot where Jason had cut the leather and sewn up the opening with thin twine. "Sit here and touch nothing, or you will be cursed for life," he commanded the shivering Snarby, then slipped toward the front entrance with a small sledgehammer clutched in his fist. He was pleased to see one of Edipon's other sons on guard duty, leaning against a pole and dozing. Jason gently lifted his leather helm with his free hand and tapped once with the hammer. The guard slept even more soundly. "Now we can get to work," Jason said when he had returned inside and clicked a firelighter to the wick of a lantern. "What are you doing? They'll see us, kill us, escaped slaves." "Stick with me, Snarby, and you'll be wearing shoes. Lights here can't be seen by the sentries. I made sure of that when I sighted the place. And we have a piece of work to do before we leave. We have to build a caroj." They did not have to build it from scratch, but there was enough truth in the statement to justify it. His most recently rebuilt and most powerful engine was still bolted to the test stand, a fact that justified all the night's risks. 3 caroj wheels lay among the other debris of the camp, and 2 of them were to be bolted to the engine while it was still on the stand. The ends of the driving axle cleared the edges of the stand. Jason threaded the securing wheel bolts into place and utilized Snarby to tighten them. At the other end of the stand was a strong swiveling post that had been a support for his test instruments, and seemed strangely large for this small task. It was. When the instruments were stripped away, a single bar remained, projecting backwards like a tiller handle. When a third wheel was fitted with a stub axle and slid into place in the forked lower end of the post, the test stand looked remarkably like a three-wheeled, steerable, steam-engine-powered platform that was mounted on legs. This is exactly what it was, what Jason had designed it to be from the first, and the supporting legs came away with the same ease that the other parts had been attached. Escape had always taken first priority in his plans. Snarby dragged over the crockery jars of oil, water, and fuel while Jason filled the tanks. He started the fire under the boiler and loaded aboard tools and the small supply of krenoi he had managed to set aside from their rations. All of this took time, but not time enough. It would soon be dawn, and they would have to leave before then, and he could no longer avoid making up his mind. He could not leave Ijal here, and if he went to get her, he could not refuse to take Myka as well. The man had saved his life, no matter what murderous idiocies he had managed to pull since that time. Jason believed that you owed something to a man who prolonged your existence, but he also wondered just how much he still owed. In Myka's case, he felt the balance of the debt to be mighty small, if not overdrawn. Perhaps this one last time. "Keep an eye on the engine, and I'll be back as soon as I can," he said, jumping to the ground and loading on equipment. "You want me to do what? Stay here with this devil machine? I cannot. It will burn and consume me." "Act your age, Snarby. Your physical age, if not your mental one. This rolling junk pile was made by men and repaired and improved by me. No demons involved. It burns oil to make heat, that makes steam, that goes to this tube to push that rod to make those wheels go around so we can move. And that is as much of the theory of the steam engine as you are going to get from me. Maybe you can understand this better. Only I can get you safely away from here. Therefore, you will stay and do as I say, or I will beat your brains in. Clear?" Snarby nodded dumbly. "Fine. All you have to do is sit here and look at this little green disk. See it? If it should pop out before I come back, turn this handle in this direction. Clear enough? That way the safety valve won't blow and wake the whole country, and we'll still have a head of steam." Jason went out past the still silent sentry and headed back toward the refinery station. Instead of a club or a dagger, he was armed with a well-tempered broadsword that he had managed to manufacture under the noses of the guards. They had examined everything he brought from the worksite since he had been working in the evenings in his room, but ignored everything he manufactured as being beyond their comprehension. This primordial mental attitude had been of immense value, for in addition to the sword he carried a sack of molotails, a simple weapon of assault whose origins were lost in prehistory. Small crocks were filled with the most combustible of the refinery's fractions, and wrapped around outside with cloth that he had soaked in the same liquid. The stench made him dizzy, and he hoped that they would repay his efforts when the time came, since they were completely untried. In use, one lit the outer covering and threw them. The crockery burst on impact, and the fuse ignited the contents. Theoretically. Getting back in proved to be as easy as getting out, and Jason felt an unmistakable twinge of regret. His subconscious had obviously been hoping that there would be a disturbance and he would have to retreat to save himself. His subconscious obviously being very short on interest in saving the slave girl and his nemesis, particularly at the risk of his own skin. His subconscious was disappointed. He was in the building where his quarters lay, trying to peek around the corner to see if a guard was at the door. There was, and he seemed to be dozing, but something jerked him awake. He had heard nothing, but he sniffed the air and wrinkled his nose. The powerful smell of water of power from Jason's molotails had roused him, and he spotted Jason before he could pull back. "Who is there?" he shouted, and advanced at a lumbering run. There was no quiet way out of this one, so Jason leaped out with an echoing shout and lunged. The blade went right under the man's guard. He must have never seen a sword before, and the tip caught him full in the throat. He expired with a bubbling wail that stirred voices deeper in the building. Jason sprang over the corpse and tore at the multifold bolts and locks that sealed the door. Footsteps were running in the distance when he finally threw the door open and ran in. "Get out, and quick! We're escaping!" he shouted at them, and pushed the dazed Ijal toward the door, and exacted a great deal of pleasure from landing a tremendous kick that literally lifted Myka through the opening, where he collided with Edipon, who had just run up, waving a club. Jason leaped over the tumbled forms, wrapped Edipon behind the ear with the hilt of his sword, and dragged Myka to his feet. "Get out to the engine works," he ordered his still uncomprehending companions. "I have a caroj there that we can get away in." He cursed them, and they finally broke into clumsy motion. There were shouts from behind him, and an armed mob of Zertanoi ran into view. Jason pulled down the hall light, burning his hand on the hot base at the same time, and applied its open flame to one of his molotails. The wick caught with a roar of flame, and he threw it at approaching soldiers before it could burn his hand. It flew toward them, hit the wall, and broke. Inflammable fuel spurted in every direction, and the flame went out. Jason cursed and grappled for another molotail, because if they didn't work, he was dead. The Zertanoi had hesitated a moment rather than walk through the puddle of spilled water of power, and in that instant he hurled the second firebomb. This one burst nicely too, and lived up to its maker's expectations when it ignited the first molotail as well, and the passageway filled with a curtain of fire. Holding his hand around the lamp flame so it wouldn't go out, Jason ran after the others. So far the alarm had not spread outside of the building, and Jason bolted the door from the outside. By the time this was broken open and the confusion sorted out, they would be clear of the buildings. There was no need for the lamp now, and would only give him away. He blew it out, and from the desert came a continuous and ear-piercing scream. "He's done it," Jason groaned. "That's the safety valve on the steam engine." He bumped into Ijal and Myka, who were milling about confusedly in the dark, kicked Myka again out of sheer malice and hatred of all mankind, and led them towards the work site at a dead run. They escaped unharmed, mainly because of the confusion on all sides of them. The Zertanoi seemed to never have experienced a night attack before, which they apparently thought this was, and did an incredible amount of rushing about and shouting. Matters were not helped by the burning building nor the unconscious form of Edipon that was carried from the blaze. All the Zertanoi had been roused by the scream of the safety valve that was still bleeding irreplaceable steam into the night air, and there was much milling about. In the confusion, the fleeing slaves were not noticed, and Jason led them around the guard post on the walls and directly toward the worksite. They were spotted as they crossed the empty ground, and after some hesitation the guard ran in pursuit. Jason was leading the enemy directly to his precious steam wagon, but he had no choice. The thing was certainly making its presence known in any case, and unless he reached it at once, the head of steam would be gone and they would be trapped. He leaped the still recumbent guard at the entrance and ran toward his machine. Snarby was cowering behind one wheel, but there was no time to give him any attention. As Jason jumped onto the platform, the safety valve closed, and the sudden stillness was frightening. The steam was gone. With frantic grabs, he spun valves and shot one glance at the indicator. There wasn't enough steam left to roll the meters. Water gurgled and the boiler hissed and clacked at him, while screams of anger came from the Zertanoi as they ran into the enclosure and saw the bootleg caroj. Jason thrust the end of a molotail into the firebox. It caught fire and he turned and hurled it at them. The angry cries turned into screams of fear as the tongues of flame licked up at the pursuers and they retreated in disorder. Jason ran after them and hastened their departure with another molotail. They seemed to be retreating as far as the refinery walls, but he could not be sure in the darkness if some of them weren't creeping around to the sides. He hurried back to the caroj, tapped on the still unmoving pressure indicator, and opened the fuel feed wide. As an afterthought, he wired down the safety valve, since his reinforced boiler should hold more pressure than the valve had been originally adjusted for. Once this was finished, he chewed at his oily fingernails, since there was nothing else that could be done until the pressure built up again. The Zertanoi would rally, someone would take charge, and they would attack the worksite. If they had enough steam before this happened, they would escape. If not... "Myka, and you too, you cowering slob Snarby, you, get behind this thing and push," Jason said. "What has happened?" Myka asked. "Have you started this revolution? If so, I will give no aid." "We're escaping, if that's all right with you. Just I, Ijal, and a guide to show us the way. You don't have to come." "I will join you. There is nothing criminal in escaping from these barbarians." "Very nice of you to say so. Now push. I want this steammobile in the center, far from all the walls and pointing toward the desert. Down the valley, I guess. Is that right, Snarby?" "Down the valley, sure. That's the way." His voice was still rasping from the earlier throttling, Jason was pleased to notice. "Stop it here, and everyone aboard. Grab onto those bars I've bolted along the side so you won't get bounced off. If we ever start moving, that is." Jason took a quick look through his workshop to make sure everything they might need was already loaded, then reluctantly climbed aboard himself. He blew out the lantern, and they sat there in the darkness, their faces lit from below by the flickering glow from the firebox, while the tensions mounted. There was no way to measure time, since each second took an eternity to drag by. The walls of the worksite cut off any view of the outside, and within a few moments imagination had peopled the night with silent hordes creeping towards them, huddling about the thin barrier of leather, ready to swoop down and crush them in an instant. "Let's run for it," Snarby gurgled, and tried to jump from the platform. "We're trapped here. We'll never get away." Jason tripped him and knocked him flat, then pounded his head against the floor planks a few times until he quieted. "I can sympathize with that poor man," Micah said severely. "You are a brute, Jason, to punish him for his natural feelings. Cease your sadistic attack and join me in a prayer." "If this poor man you are so sorry for had simply done his duty and watched the boiler, we would all be safely away from here by now. And if you have enough breath for a prayer, put it to better use by blowing into the firebox. It's not going to be wishes or prayers that get us out of here, just a head of steam." A howled battle cry was echoed by massed voices, and a squad of Zertanoi burst in through the entrance, and at the same instant the rear of the leather wall went down and more armed men swarmed over it. The immobile Caroi was trapped between the two groups of attackers, who laughed happily as they charged. Jason cursed and lit 4 Molotails at the same time and hurled them 2 and 2 in opposite directions. Before they hit, he had jumped to the steam valve and wound it open. With a hissing clank, the Caroi shuddered and got under way. For the moment, the attackers were held back by the walls of flame, and screamed even louder as the machine moved away at right angles from between their two groups. The air whistled with crossbow bolts, but most were badly aimed, and only a few thudded into the baggage. With each revolution of the wheels, their speed picked up, and when they hit the walls, the hides parted with a creaking snap. Strips of leather whipped at them. Then they were through. The shouts and the fires grew dimmer behind them as they streaked down the valley at a suicidal pace, hissing, rattling, and crashing over the bumps. Jason clung to the tiller and shouted for Micah to come relieve him, since if he let go of the thing they would turn and crash in an instant, and as long as he held it he couldn't cut down the steam. Some of this finally penetrated to Micah because he crawled forward, grasping desperately to every handhold until he crouched beside Jason. "Grab this tiller and hold it straight and steer around anything big enough to see." As soon as the steering was taken over, Jason worked his way back to the engine and throttled down. They slowed to a clanking walk, then stopped completely. Ijal moaned, and Jason felt as if every inch of his body had been beaten with hammers. There was no sign of pursuit, since it would be at least an hour before they could raise steam in the Caroi, and no one on foot could possibly have matched their headlong pace. The lantern he had used earlier had vanished during the wild ride, so Jason dug out another one of his own construction. "On your feet, Snarby," he ordered. "I've cracked us all out of slavery, so now it is time for you to do some of the guiding that you were telling me about. Walk ahead with this light and pick out a nice smooth track going in the right direction. I never did have a chance to build headlights for this machine, so you will have to do instead." Snarby climbed down unsteadily and walked out in front. Jason opened the valve a bit, and they clattered forward on his trail as Micah turned the tiller to follow. Ijal crawled over and settled herself against Jason's side, shivering with cold and fright. He patted her shoulder. "Relax," he said. "From now on, this is just a pleasure trip.